Please, you have to help my sister. The words stopped him in his tracks, a small, sharp voice trembling against the biting Chicago wind whipping off Lake Michigan. Arthur Sterling, the billionaire architect of Sterling Solutions, turned his head with a slowness that felt foreign to his usually decisive nature. He had just exited the main entrance of Lakeside General Hospital, having concluded a sterile photo opportunity for a new neonatal wing his foundation had financed. His afternoon had been a blur of performative check signing, limp handshakes, and smiles that felt painted on. He'd anticipated nothing more than the frigid silence of the city as he walked toward his waiting town car. Instead, he found a boy, barely reaching his waist, standing on the frozen pavement. The child was swallowed by a threadbare coat, his boots stained with the grimy city snow. His cheeks were chapped a raw, painful red, and his dark curls were a tangled mess, escaping a worn beanie. He clutched a stuffed lion under one arm, its fur worn smooth from years of affection. "Please, mister," the boy repeated, his small gloved hand tugging at the sleeve of Arthur's cashmere overcoat. "My sister's hurt. She fell, and she won't get up." His voice cracked with a desperate urgency. "The ladies at the desk said we gotta wait, but nobody's coming. They said she needs some kind of special doctor, but they're not getting one fast enough." Arthur blinked, trying to process the raw plea that had pierced his insulated world. "My name's Leo," the boy said, as if sensing his confusion. "I'm 9. My sister Lily is 6. We came because she fell down the stairs at Mrs. Gable's place." He sniffled, wiping his nose on the back of his mismatched glove. "She's real sick inside. They said something's wrong with her brain." He tried to stand taller, to project a bravery his small frame couldn't quite contain. "I saw you on the news. You're rich, aren't you? Rich people make things happen." Arthur stared down at the boy, a strange mixture of irritation and a long dormant ache stirring within him. "Leo, I'm not a doctor," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "But you've got money, right?" Leo shot back, his gaze unwavering. "And money makes people listen." As if on cue, a frantic shout echoed from just inside the hospital's revolving doors. "We need a gurney over here, now!" Leo's eyes widened with terror. "That's her! That's Lily!" He spun around and darted back inside. Arthur, moved by an impulse he didn't understand, followed, his long, powerful strides easily catching up. Inside the bustling emergency room lobby, a small girl lay on the cold linoleum floor near the triage desk. Her body was limp, her limbs twisted at an unnatural angle. Her lips were tinged with a pale blue, her breathing terrifyingly shallow. A pair of orderlies stood nearby, their expressions a mixture of concern and helplessness. A young nurse was on the phone, her voice strained but lacking any real command. "Where is the trauma team?" Arthur's voice boomed through the controlled chaos, sharp as shattered glass. "She's a child, for God's sake." "We're waiting for a pediatric neurologist to sign off," the nurse replied, glancing at him dismissively, before turning her attention back to the phone. Arthur's voice hardened into a blade of ice. "You're waiting for what? An authorization code? A permission slip? She's unconscious on your floor." Leo was on his knees beside his sister, patting her cheek with a trembling hand. "Lily, wake up. Please, Lily, wake up." A second nurse, older and with the weary eyes of a veteran, approached the scene. Even she seemed to falter under the intensity of Arthur's furious glare. "Get a gurney," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Get her to imaging, and have the on-call neurosurgeon meet me there. Or I swear to God, I will have this hospital's charter under federal review before the sun comes up." A palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere. The weight of genuine, earned authority settled over the room like a physical force. Within moments, Lily was being carefully lifted onto a stretcher. An oxygen mask was placed over her small face, and a resident materialized, beginning a rapid assessment. Yet, Arthur could still see a flicker of hesitation in their movements, the subtle calculus that often appeared when a patient was uninsured, a ward of the state, or both. Leo held onto Lily's hand as the staff wheeled her down a long corridor toward the pediatric intensive care unit, his whispers a constant, desperate stream. He didn't shed a tear, he just kept talking to her. Arthur stood back, his hands clenched into tight fists, his breath pluming in the cold air that still seeped in through the automatic doors. The first nurse, the one who had been so dismissive, looked up at him, a flicker of recognition finally dawning in her eyes. Her mouth opened as if to apologize. "Don't," Arthur snapped. "Your silence already said everything." He turned his attention to Leo. "Is there anyone else with you two?" The boy shook his head. "Just us. Mrs. Gable lets us stay with her sometimes, but she's really old. She can't get downtown." "You don't have insurance?" Arthur asked, though the answer was already painfully obvious. "No, sir," Leo said, his voice small. "They asked for a card. I had the one our mom used to have, but they said it was no good." Arthur drew a deep, ragged breath. He felt it again, that damned, hollow ache he thought he had buried 9 years ago. Charlotte, his own daughter, lost to a sudden aggressive brain aneurysm, the same quiet fading, the same silent, helpless suffering. Leo reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slightly crushed but still wrapped piece of saltwater taffy. He held it out to Arthur. "It's all I have," he said, "but you should have it. For helping Lily." Arthur looked from the candy to the boy's earnest, tear-streaked face. "You keep it," he said, his voice thick. "Give it to her when she wakes up." Leo managed a small, exhausted smile. It was worn and fragile, but it was real. "I will." Arthur didn't understand the lump forming in his throat, or why his hands trembled as he shoved them back into his pockets. But something fundamental had shifted, not just in the hospital, but inside him. For the first time in nearly a decade, the man who could acquire any company, any property, any luxury he desired, realized there was one thing he hadn't possessed in a very long time: a reason to truly care. The hallway outside the pediatric ICU smelled of antiseptic and silent, desperate bargains with God. Arthur sat rigidly on a cold plastic bench, his gaze fixed on the closed double doors through which Lily had vanished what felt like an eternity ago. Leo sat beside him, his small frame hunched over, his feet dangling inches above the polished floor. He hugged his stuffed lion, his fingers digging into its worn mane as if he feared it might drift away into the sterile air. But he wasn't crying. Arthur glanced at him. The absence of tears was more unsettling than any outburst would have been. There was just a profound stillness, the kind you saw in old soldiers, not 9-year-old boys. It was as if a much older soul was trapped inside that small body. He had witnessed grief before. It was usually loud, chaotic, and messy. This was different. This was a heavy, settled sorrow that seemed to have taken root in the boy's very bones. "You don't have to be so strong right now," Arthur said quietly. Leo looked up, his expression uncomprehending. "It's okay to cry, Leo," he added. The boy shook his head slowly, a sad finality in his voice. "Crying won't help Lily." There was no anger, no defiance, just the simple statement of a harsh fact he had learned far too young. Arthur turned away, a tightness constricting his throat. This child possessed more self-control than most executives he dealt with, and the sight of it was gut-wrenching. Across the hall, a passing nurse did a double-take when she recognized Arthur. She leaned toward a colleague, whispering audibly, "That's him, the Sterling Solutions guy." "The billionaire?" Leo heard them. He turned his wide, curious eyes to Arthur. "Are you really a billionaire?" Arthur let out a weary sigh. "I suppose so." Leo's brow furrowed in thought. "So you could buy a lot of new brains if you needed to." He almost smiled, but the expression died on his lips. "Brains aren't like computers, Leo. You can't just order them." Leo looked down, considering this. "Then why do people say rich people don't die?" Arthur blinked. "Who says that?" "Everybody," he replied simply. "They say if you have enough money, you get to live forever." He leaned back against the wall, folding his arms across his chest. "Money can buy the best doctors and the fanciest hospitals," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But it can't buy you more time, and it can never buy back a life." Leo didn't respond. He just sat there, swinging his legs. Then, as if the thought had just surfaced from a deep place, he asked, "Did you ever lose someone?" Arthur inhaled sharply. He considered deflecting, but the truth was etched so deeply onto his face that a lie would be pointless. "Yes," he said, the word barely a whisper. "My daughter, Charlotte." Leo was quiet for a moment. "Was she little, like Lily?" "She was 8. Leo nodded, as if this information fit into some grim puzzle he was assembling. "Did she have a stuffed animal?" Arthur closed his eyes, a vivid image flashing behind them. "She had a plush octopus. Its tentacles were always getting tangled." Did she die here?" Leo asked, his voice soft. Arthur hesitated. "No, in New York." "Oh, listen." Leo leaned his head back against the bench. "I bet they didn't make you wait." The observation struck him with the force of a physical blow. Before he could formulate a reply, the ICU doors swung open. A nurse stepped out, a clipboard in her hand, her expression carefully neutral. Arthur was on his feet in an instant. "How is she?" The nurse glanced at Leo before addressing Arthur. "She's stable for the moment, but there's significant swelling. We're inducing a coma to reduce the pressure on her brain. We can't proceed with any further intervention without consent from a legal guardian." "I'll sign," Leo said quickly, sliding off the bench. The nurse blinked, her professional mask slipping for a second. "I'm sorry, sweetie, but you're not old enough." "He's all she has," Arthur interjected, his voice sharp. "I understand that, sir, but without a next of kin or official guardianship papers, there's a limit to what procedures we can authorize." Arthur's tone hardened. "So, let me get this straight. Unless someone with a gold-plated insurance card and a team of lawyers shows up, you're just going to let her lie in there until it's too late?" The nurse flinched. "That's not fair, sir." "Neither is a child dying over a bureaucratic technicality." There was a long, tense pause. "Is there anyone at all we can contact?" she asked finally. Leo shook his head. "Mrs. Gable, but she's really old. She can't come all the way down here." Arthur pulled out his phone. "Get me your supervisor." "Sir, I'm not asking." The nurse hesitated, then gave a curt nod and walked briskly down the hall. Arthur sat down again. Leo was watching him with an intense, analytical gaze. "Are you going to get mad at everyone who won't help us?" He paused, considering the question. "I might have to." Leo seemed to think about that. Then he whispered, "I'm glad." They sat in silence once more. Finally, Arthur turned to him. "Are you hungry?" The boy gave a single, small nod. He stood and offered his hand. "Let's go find something to eat in this place." Leo took his hand, his fingers small and cold in Arthur's grasp. They walked together toward the hospital cafeteria, Arthur consciously shortening his long strides to match the boy's. In the elevator, Leo looked up at him. "Do billionaires eat in cafeterias?" "Only when they're with someone important," he replied. Leo looked down at his worn boots and smiled, just a little. The cafeteria was nearly empty, buzzing under the glare of harsh fluorescent lights. Arthur led him to the hot food line. The options were grim: dry-looking chicken fingers, gluey mashed potatoes, and overcooked green beans. Leo stared at the food with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. "You ever have real mac and cheese?" he asked. Arthur nodded. "I make it myself. 5 different cheeses." Leo looked up at him as if he'd just announced he could breathe fire. "You cook?" "I used to," he admitted. "Not so much anymore." The boy wrinkled his nose. "That's sad." "Yeah," Arthur said, the word heavier than he expected. "It is." They took their trays to a quiet table by a large window. The Chicago skyline glowed beyond the glass, a brilliant tapestry of gold and sapphire against the inky blackness. Leo ate in a focused silence, not complaining, just methodically consuming the food of a hungry child. Arthur didn't touch his own meal. His mind was already a whirlwind of logistics: calls to be made, favors to be called in, lawyers to be summoned. If this hospital wouldn't move, he would find one that would, whatever the cost. Charlotte had died while people waited, and Lily wouldn't suffer the same fate. Not if he had anything to say about it. As they finished, Leo meticulously wiped his mouth with a paper napkin and asked, "Will I get to see her again tonight?" "I'll make sure of it," Arthur promised. Leo nodded and stood up, his stuffed lion tucked securely under his arm. Just before they left the cafeteria, he looked at Arthur again, his expression serious. "I think Charlotte would have liked you." This time, Arthur didn't try to hide his reaction. The raw pain and the flicker of hope, all of it stirred by a 9-year-old boy who refused to cry. Arthur Sterling stood before the hospital administrator's office as if preparing for a hostile takeover. The polished brass plaque on the door read, "Dr. Simon Vance, Chief Administrator." He had been in countless rooms like this, opulent spaces where men in expensive suits debated risk versus reward, weighing public image against moral obligation. He was typically the one presiding over the discussion, not the one demanding entry. Behind him, Leo sat quietly in a chair by the window, clutching his lion and swinging his legs, affecting a nonchalance that was clearly a performance. This was not a routine visit for him. Arthur raised his hand and knocked, the sound sharp and definitive. "Come in." Arthur entered the office. It was a sanctuary of calculated comfort, with plush carpeting that muffled every sound, dark mahogany furniture, and a wall of framed degrees that broadcasted a lifetime of achievement. Dr. Vance looked up from behind his expansive desk, his expression a mixture of surprise and mild curiosity. "Mr. Sterling," he said, rising to his feet, "this is unexpected. You're about to clarify for me why a 6-year-old girl is in your ICU without a clear treatment plan because of a paperwork issue," Arthur stated, bypassing any pleasantries. His tone was level, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Vance blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "I understand we have a child in a critical situation. I can assure you, my staff is providing the best possible care within the confines of your legal department's comfort zone," Arthur finished for him. Vance held up a placating hand. "It's not a matter of comfort, Mr. Sterling. It's a matter of liability. Without a legal guardian or emergency state placement documents, our options are severely limited. We can provide stabilization, but nothing invasive or long-term." "And if she dies while you're waiting?" Arthur asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Do you add her death certificate to your collection on the wall? Vance sighed, a flicker of genuine frustration in his eyes. Look, I understand your concern. Truly, I do. But the system has its protocols. Arthur took a step closer to the desk. The system is broken. And when a man with my resources says that publicly, in front of a microphone, people tend to pay attention. Now Vance's posture stiffened. Is that a threat? It's a promise, Arthur said. That girl could be gone within days. Her brother has no one. I am willing to personally sponsor her entire course of treatment. Sign any legal waiver you require. If liability is your primary concern, I will assume all of it. The administrator glanced at a folder on his desk. And what is your relationship to these children? Arthur paused. He hadn't yet articulated the answer, not even to himself. I lost someone, he said, his voice dropping, to a similar condition. I know what happens when you wait too long. See, Vance studied him for a long, silent moment, the institutional mask giving way to a flicker of human understanding. I can authorize a temporary emergency guardianship placement for the next 72 hours, he said reluctantly. It's not a permanent solution, but it will grant you the authority to consent to immediate procedures. That's all I need, Arthur said, turning to leave. As he reached the door, Vance added, There's a social worker from the Department of Child and Family Services already assigned to their case, Susan Croft. She'll be in touch. Make sure she is. Back in the hallway, Arthur found Leo exactly as he had left him, in the same chair, with the same stoic expression. But his fingers were now drumming a nervous, rhythmic pattern on the armrest. We can go see Lily now, Arthur said simply. The boy's face brightened, but he quickly reined in his hope. Only if she's awake. Even if she's not. They walked back toward the ICU together. As they passed the main nurse's station, one of the younger nurses, perhaps early 30s, with a kind face and blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun, gave Leo a small, gentle wave. You're Leo, right? With Lily? Leo nodded shyly. I put your drawing on the wall by her monitor, she said. His eyes lit up. You did? The nurse smiled warmly. It's the most cheerful thing in the whole unit. Arthur offered her a nod of gratitude as they continued down the corridor. Inside the ICU room, Lily was a small, still figure amidst a web of tubes and wires. Machines beeped in a soft, monotonous chorus. A tube in her chest fluttered with each mechanically assisted breath. Her skin had a waxy pallor that was unnatural for a child, but she was alive. Leo climbed into the chair beside her bed and, without a word, took her small, limp hand in his. Arthur stood silently at the foot of the bed, observing the profound, unshakable connection between the two siblings, a bond that transcended even unconsciousness. Suddenly, Leo looked up at him. Mr. Sterling? Yes. Can people lose their names? He tilted his head, confused by the question. What do you mean? Leo looked from his sister's still face back to Arthur. Like, if nobody knows who you are, and nobody takes care of you, do you just stop being you? Arthur was silent for a beat too long. No, he said finally, his voice firm. Names don't disappear just because the world isn't saying them out loud. Leo nodded slowly, as if he wasn't entirely convinced. Sometimes it feels like we're not real people unless someone remembers we're here. Arthur pulled a chair closer and sat down. When my daughter died, he began, the words feeling rusty and painful. I kept saying her name, over and over. Charlotte. 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 I thought if I stopped, maybe she would vanish completely. Leo looked at him, his gaze direct and searching. Did she? No, Arthur whispered. Not really, because even now, you've heard her name. A faint, sad smile touched Leo's lips. Then, maybe if I keep saying Lily, she'll stay too. They sat together in the quiet of the room, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. A few minutes later, the kind nurse returned with a warm blanket. Visiting hours are technically over soon. I want to stay, Leo said, his grip on his sister's hand tightening. Arthur looked at the nurse. He's staying with me. I'll cover any necessary arrangements or fees. The nurse hesitated, then nodded. I'll let the night staff know. When she had gone, Arthur looked at Leo. I'll speak with the social worker tomorrow. We'll find a way to make sure Lily gets everything she needs. Leo tilted his head. Why are you helping us so much? Arthur looked down at Lily's pale face, then back at the boy. Because someone should have done more to help Charlotte, he said, the admission raw and honest. And nobody did. Leo reached out and took his hand. It was a small, warm, trusting gesture that sent an unexpected jolt through Arthur. He knew then that this was no longer about charity or assuaging old guilt. This was the beginning of something he had never anticipated. Responsibility, not to a board of directors or to a foundation, but to two children who were just names in a broken system, with no real place in the world. Yet. The next morning, Arthur arrived at the hospital before the sun had fully risen, its early rays just beginning to warm the glass of the east-facing windows. His suit was impeccably tailored, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed a night devoid of rest. He had spent hours on the phone, first with his legal team, then with his personal physician, and finally with a contact at the Illinois Department of Child and Family Services. Inside the pediatric ICU, Leo was curled up in a large reclining chair next to Lily's bed, his stuffed lion propped protectively on his chest. He had finally succumbed to exhaustion, still holding his sister's hand. The girl remained unconscious, but the faintest hint of color had returned to her cheeks. Arthur stood quietly in the doorway, watching them. Leo slept in a tight ball, as if afraid the cavernous chair might swallow him whole if he dared to stretch out. He remembered Charlotte sleeping that way, so small and contained. He used to tiptoe into her room in the dead of night, just to listen to the sound of her breathing. He still caught himself listening for it in the crushing silence of his mansion. A soft cough from behind him broke the stillness. He turned to see a woman standing there. She was in her mid-50s, African-American, dressed in sensible shoes and a professional gray cardigan. She carried a worn leather satchel and had a folder tucked under one arm. Susan Croft, she said, her voice calm and measured. DCFS. Arthur stepped out into the hallway, gesturing for her to join him in a small consultation room nearby. I appreciate you coming so quickly, he said once the door was closed. I was told the situation was urgent, she replied, setting her bag on the table. A child in the ICU without legal guardianship usually is. Arthur sat across from her. Lily and Leo were in the informal care of a neighbor, a Mrs. Gable. Elderly, no formal custody agreement, no power of attorney. Their mother passed away nearly a year ago. There's no father on record. It's a complicated situation. Susan nodded, already opening her folder. We've seen worse. He leaned forward, getting to the point. I want to assume temporary guardianship, long enough to authorize Lily's surgery and to arrange for their long-term care. My lawyers are already drafting the necessary paperwork. I will assume full financial and legal responsibility for both children. Susan looked up from her file, her eyes seasoned with years of navigating human tragedy and bureaucratic mazes. Mr. Sterling, forgive my bluntness, But billionaires don't typically adopt children they meet in hospital lobbies. I didn't find them, he said simply. They found me. She studied him for a long, assessing moment. You do understand that taking on guardianship, even temporarily, is more than a signature and a press release? There will be background checks, home evaluations. More importantly, it's an emotional commitment. These aren't charitable opportunities, Mr. Sterling. They're lives. I'm aware of that, he said quietly. Her tone softened slightly. Why these two? He didn't hesitate. Because they remind me of someone I lost, and because I can't live with myself if I walk away from them now. She closed the folder, tapping her pen on its cover. All right, let's go meet the boy. Back in the ICU, Leo was just waking up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes with the sleeve of his coat. He looked up warily as they entered. Leo, this is Ms. Croft, Arthur said gently. She's here to help. The boy's expression was uncertain. Are you going to take us away? Susan crouched down to his level. No, sweetheart. I'm here to make sure you and Lily are safe, to make sure you're with someone who can care for you properly. Leo nodded slowly. Mr. Sterling helped us. He yelled at the nurses when they wouldn't do anything. He stayed here all night. Susan smiled. He told me. I think he might be okay, Leo concluded, with the solemnity of a judge. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Only might? Leo offered a sleepy grin. Susan stood up. I'll need to visit your home later today, Mr. Sterling, to process the emergency placement paperwork. He nodded. You'll find it's clean, quiet, a bit too large for one person. And their school records have been requested? Medical files are on the way? She narrowed her eyes, impressed, but still cautious. You don't waste any time. I've wasted too much of it already, he said. Susan turned back to Leo. How about I take you down to the cafeteria for some breakfast, while Mr. Sterling has a word with the doctors? Leo looked to Arthur for confirmation. Will you come back? Always, he promised. He watched them walk down the hall together, Leo's small hand tucked securely in Susan's. It no longer felt like charity. It felt like the beginning of a vow. In the consultation room, Arthur met again with Dr. Vance and the hospital's top neurologist. The prognosis was more dire than he had feared. Lily needed immediate surgery to relieve the pressure on her brain. But the damage was extensive. She would be placed in a medically induced coma for the foreseeable future. Her chances were slim unless something changed dramatically. I'll make the calls, Arthur said, his voice resolute. Whatever specialists you need, research programs, experimental treatments, I'll fund it all. Vance was wary. You understand, Mr. Sterling, even with unlimited resources, some things are beyond our control. Then we'd better start controlling what we can, now. When he returned to the cafeteria, Leo was finishing a bowl of oatmeal, speaking softly to Susan. I think he should get a dog, he was saying. Susan raised an eyebrow. Mr. Sterling? No, Lily, Leo clarified. When she gets better. Dogs help people feel brave. Arthur smiled. I'll see what I can do. Leo looked up, his expression suddenly serious. Is Lily going to be okay? The question landed squarely in his chest, a direct hit. He knelt beside the boy's chair. I don't know yet, he said truthfully, but I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure she is. And I promise you, she's not alone anymore. The boy nodded, his gaze grave. Good, 'cause she's really bad at being alone. Susan stood, glancing at her watch. I'll be at your residence by 4 o'clock. I'll be ready. As they left the hospital, Arthur paused in the grand lobby and looked back at the pediatric wing. For the first time in 9 years, he felt something other than a hollow ache return to his chest. It wasn't pride or power. It was purpose. He had no idea where this path would lead, but he knew exactly where it had begun. With a boy who wouldn't cry, a girl who needed a miracle, and a man who finally had a reason to fight for one. Arthur had never felt a sense of apprehension walking into his own home until that afternoon. The long, winding driveway leading up to the Sterling estate was bordered by majestic oaks he had planted himself 2 decades ago. Their burnished autumn leaves crunched under the tires of the black town car that brought him and Leo from the hospital. The mansion, a starkly modern structure of glass, steel, and stone, stood at the crest of the hill like a silent, imposing monument. As they pulled to a stop, Leo pressed his face against the window, his eyes wide with awe. "Is this your house or a hotel?" he whispered. A small smile touched Arthur's lips. "It's just a house, far too big for one person." Leo didn't reply, his gaze fixed on the towering windows as if expecting a movie star to emerge. The massive front door swung open automatically as they approached. Inside, the cavernous marble foyer amplified the sound of their footsteps. Arthur's housekeeper, Helen, was already waiting, a tablet in her hand. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a kind but no-nonsense demeanor, her white hair pulled back in a tidy bun. "Mr. Sterling," she greeted him. "The social worker arrived about 20 minutes ago. She's waiting in the sunroom." Leo's hand tightened on Arthur's. "It's all right," he said quietly. "She just needs to see where you'll be staying for a little while." They walked past a sweeping spiral staircase and through a long gallery hallway lined with black and white photographs, mostly stark landscapes, but a few of Arthur and a smiling, gap-toothed Charlotte, and into the sunroom. Susan Croft sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, sipping a cup of tea. She looked up and offered a professional smile. "Very well maintained." Arthur nodded. "Thank you, Helen. I've had the guest wing prepared for Leo and Lily." Susan turned her attention to Leo. "How do you feel about staying here?" Leo looked up at Arthur, then around the vast, impeccably decorated room. "It's big. But is it too big?" Susan pressed gently. He shook his head. "No, just quiet." Susan made a note on her legal pad. After a brief tour of the house, they convened in Arthur's study. It was a warm, masculine space with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, supple leather armchairs, and a fireplace, where a low fire was already crackling. "I have the documents here," Susan said, opening her briefcase. "Temporary guardianship for both children. The initial term is for 60 days, renewable pending a full background review and home inspection." Arthur took the pen she offered and signed his name. The signature flowed with practiced ease. Contracts were his native language. But this one felt different. This one had weight. Leo watched him intently. "Does this mean you're our new dad?" he asked, his voice soft. Arthur looked up from the document, his heart giving a strange lurch. "Not officially. But it does mean I'm responsible for you now. And I take that very seriously." The boy nodded. "That's okay. I don't need another dad. I just need someone who won't leave." Susan glanced between them, her professional facade softening for a moment, but she said nothing. When she left an hour later, the sun was casting long amber stripes across the polished stone floors. "Come on," Arthur said, offering Leo his hand. "Let me show you your room." He led him down a quiet, carpeted hallway to a guest suite that had been hastily converted. A child's bed with soft, new blankets had replaced the queen, and a small bookshelf stood in the corner next to a window seat piled with cushions. Leo stepped inside slowly, running his hand along the cool glass of the window. Is this all for me? Yes, Arthur said. You can put your things wherever you want. I don't have things, he said plainly. Just this. He held up the stuffed lion. Arthur nodded. Then we'll get you some more, but only the things you pick out yourself. Leo sat on the edge of the bed and looked around again. It smells like lemons. That's Helen, Arthur explained. She has a deep-seated belief that lemon-scented polish can solve most of life's problems. Leo giggled, a small, bright sound in the quiet room. Then his expression grew serious again. Is it okay if I don't sleep by myself? Arthur hesitated. You want me to stay? No, he said. Just, maybe you could leave the door open, in case Lily wakes up and needs me. I'll leave it wide open. That night, Arthur sat in his home office, the phone pressed to his ear. No, Steve, I don't care how long the waiting list is. You call every pediatric neurosurgery department in the country, he said, his voice low but firm. I'll pay for the transport, the procedure, the post-operative care, whatever it takes. He ended the call and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. He hadn't fought for anything with this kind of raw determination in years. Not since Charlotte. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Leo stood in the doorway, his lion under one arm. I couldn't sleep. Arthur pushed his laptop aside. How about some warm milk? The boy nodded. In the vast, stainless steel kitchen, Leo sat on a stool at the granite island while Arthur heated milk on the stove, an act so familiar and yet so distant it made his chest ache. He hadn't done this since Charlotte was a little girl. He handed Leo the mug carefully. Did your daughter like warm milk too? Leo asked. She did, he said, with a little bit of honey. This has honey, Leo observed after a sip. You remember things good. Arthur smiled. I try. Leo looked up at him, his expression thoughtful. I think maybe you were supposed to find us. Why do you say that? Because nobody else did. Later, after tucking him back into bed and promising once more to keep the door open, Arthur stood in the silent hallway, watching him drift to sleep. It was all still so new, so fragile, but something had fundamentally shifted, not just in the layout of his home, but in the landscape of his soul. The man who had once built firewalls and impenetrable data centers now found himself guarding something far more precious. 2 children who had every reason to be forgotten by a system that had already lost their names. But not this time. Not on his watch. The house awoke in silence, as it always did. But this morning, the silence was punctuated by the soft padding of small footsteps down the long hallway, the sound of cautious exploration and quiet wonder. Arthur was already awake, seated at the massive kitchen table with a mug of black coffee and a tablet glowing in front of him. He was reading over Lily's latest vitals, sent directly from the hospital's monitoring system. Leo appeared in the doorway, swallowed by one of Helen's oversized cardigans that hung nearly to his knees. His dark curls were tousled from sleep, and his stuffed lion was, as always, clutched under one arm. Morning, Arthur said gently. Is she okay? Leo asked, foregoing any other greeting. Arthur glanced at the screen and then back at the boy. She's stable. That's a good thing for now. Leo slid into the chair opposite him. Stable sounds like not better. It means she's holding on, Arthur replied, and we're getting closer to arranging the surgery she needs. I have a team working on it around the clock. Is your team like superheroes? He asked, his eyes wide and serious. Arthur managed a small smile. Not quite that exciting. Mostly just lawyers and doctors, but they fight their own kinds of battles. Leo nodded, seemingly satisfied with the explanation. Helen entered quietly and placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. He mumbled a polite, "Thank you," before starting to eat. "Ms. Croft called this morning," Helen informed Arthur. "She's arranging the next steps for the long-term placement evaluation. Said she was very impressed with your initial home visit." Arthur simply nodded, his gaze distant. He couldn't shake the image of Lily, so still and small beneath the tangle of tubes and monitors. She looked too much like Charlotte had at the very end. The thought was a ghost that haunted the corners of his mind, one he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge out loud. After breakfast, Arthur held out a coat for Leo. "Want to go see her?" The boy's face lit up instantly. "Can I?" "We'll take my car. Bring the lion." On the drive to the hospital, Leo watched the Chicago cityscape roll by with a quiet intensity, his eyes tracking every mural on the brick buildings, every person hurrying along the sidewalk. "Do people get better faster if someone visits them?" he asked. "I think so," Arthur said. "At least their hearts do." When they arrived at Lakeside General, they were met by Dr. Chen, the lead neurologist on Lily's case. She was a petite woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, and she carried herself with a quiet authority that didn't need to be announced. "Mr. Sterling, Leo, I'm glad you're here," she said. Leo instinctively tightened his grip on Arthur's hand. "We've reviewed Lily's scans again," Dr. Chen began, her tone serious. "And we've confirmed the swelling is not receding as we'd hoped. She needs a specialized cranial surgery within the next week, or the damage could become irreversible." Arthur swallowed hard. "And the surgeon?" "We're advocating for Dr. Albright, the best pediatric neurosurgeon in the Midwest. His schedule is booked for months. Your sponsorship helps, and I've already reached out to his office. There's a chance he can fit her in, but it's a long shot." Leo frowned, not fully grasping the medical terminology, but understanding the gravity in her voice. Dr. Chen crouched down to his level. "We're doing everything we can for your sister, sweetheart. She's a very strong little girl." Leo nodded. "She's always been strong, but sometimes even strong people need help." Dr. Chen smiled. "Yes, they do." They entered the ICU, and Leo immediately took up his usual post at Lily's bedside. He began to talk to her in a low, steady voice, telling her about the eggs he'd had for breakfast, how big the house was, and how Mr. Sterling's car had heaters in the seats. Arthur stood silently by the window, his arms crossed, a lump forming in his throat. "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Chen said softly behind him, "have you considered registering as a potential medical advocate?" He turned. "You mean legally representing her during the medical process?" "Yes. It would grant you the authority to make emergency decisions and access priority pathways that are typically reserved for legal guardians. It could help us secure Dr. Albright." "I'll do it," he said, without a moment's hesitation. "There's a significant amount of paperwork." "No," Arthur interrupted. "Use my legal team. I'll have my assistant send you their contact information." He turned back toward the window and watched Leo carefully place his lion next to Lily on the pillow. He whispered something in her ear, something Arthur couldn't make out, but somehow understood completely. It was a mixture of hope, pleading, and unconditional love. An hour later, they were back in the car. Leo was quiet for most of the ride, but as they neared the estate, he asked, "Why don't you have any pictures of your daughter in the living room?" Arthur's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Charlotte died a long time ago," he said, his voice strained. "For a while I couldn't bear to look at her face. It hurt too much." Leo looked down at his lap. "I think you should put them back up." He glanced at the boy in the rearview mirror. "Why?" "Because people only really disappear when nobody talks about them anymore." That's what you told me." His chest ached at the simple, profound wisdom of the boy's words. When they returned to the mansion, Arthur went to the attic for the first time in nearly a decade. The air was thick with dust and stillness. In the far corner, shrouded by a white sheet, was a box labeled Charlotte. He carried it downstairs as if it were made of spun glass. In the study, he opened it. Inside were photographs, crayon drawings, old-school notebooks, a single ballet slipper, and a handmade birthday card that read, "To the best dad in the wold," in wobbly pink letters. He sat on the floor with Leo beside him, and for the first time in a long, long time, he told someone about his daughter. He talked about her love for dancing, the way she always hummed while brushing her teeth, and how she demanded pancakes shaped like stars every Saturday morning. Leo laughed. "Lily likes them shaped like dinosaurs." They spent the rest of the evening rearranging the grand mantelpiece in the living room. Arthur placed a framed photo of Charlotte front and center. "She's really pretty," Leo said. "You look like her." "Other way around," Arthur replied, a genuine smile reaching his eyes. That night, after Leo had gone to bed, Arthur stood alone in the quiet living room, staring at his daughter's smiling face. "You'd like him," he whispered to the photograph. "He's got your courage." And somewhere deep inside him, a wound that had been festering for 9 years began to heal. Just a little. Enough to keep going. Enough to believe that Lily might still have a chance.